Well, tonight we're going to study Ruth chapter 2, focusing on verses 6 through 11. Quick review, Act 1 is entitled Death and Emptiness, because that's Naomi's story. She leaves the land of Israel with a husband and 2 sons. She goes to the land of Moab. Her husband dies. Both of her sons marry Moabite women. 10 years later, both of her sons die. And then Naomi makes her way back to her hometown, to the town of Bethlehem, back in the land of Israel, with Ruth, the Moabite daughter-in-law. One of the daughters-in-laws decided to stay in Moab, but Ruth was determined that she was going to the land of Israel with Naomi. And so, Act 1, very depressing, very negative, very difficult to read, very difficult to experience and live through, but it does end on a note of hope. It's barley harvest season. So Naomi and Ruth are arriving at a good time back in the land of Israel. The chapter starts with a famine. It ends with a harvest. Then in Act 2, the spotlight is no longer on Naomi, it's on Ruth. It's still Naomi's emptiness that needs to be resolved, but Ruth is going to play a big part in that story. So in Act 2 and in Act 3, it's the story of Ruth and how she helps out Naomi. So the spotlight is now going to be on her. There are 3 scenes in Act 2, and I put these in your notes in case you can't see them on the screen. The first one is the main characters are Naomi and Ruth. The location is Naomi's house, and Ruth has a plan. I mean, here are 2 women without men trying to survive in the ancient world. They have to find food. There's no man to provide for them, so somebody has to do something, and Ruth has a plan of how she can glean in the fields to be able to support them. Scene number 2 is the main characters are Ruth and Boaz and the workers who work for Boaz, most likely his servants, and the location is out in the field, a field owned by Boaz. And that's the encounter between Ruth and Boaz, and we're going to look at that this evening. And then finally, scene number 3, Naomi and Ruth are back together again. It's back at Naomi's house, and Ruth is going to tell Naomi everything that happened to her that day. And she's going to give a really wonderful report, as it turns out. Well, scene 1 is the plan of Ruth, and Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 opens up with a new character, and it's a man. His name is Boaz, and he's actually a good man. He's a spiritual man. He's an honest man. He's wealthy. He follows the ways of God, and as we're going to find out, he treats people with respect. So the good news also is that there's a connection between Naomi and Boaz. Actually, Boaz comes from Elimelech's family, but Naomi was married to Elimelech before he passed away. So there is a family connection between the 2. And our hope gets even greater when Ruth decides to go out and glean in a field. And she has no idea where she's going. And so she happens to enter into a field that's owned by Boaz. She has no idea who Boaz is at this point, but she happens to stumble onto one of his fields. And so because of that, there's anticipation that maybe Boaz can do something to help her. So we then move into the encounter between Ruth and Boaz. And we just barely started on this last week. Boaz lives in the city, the town really. It's the little town of Bethlehem. And his field is located on the outskirts of town. So Boaz owns the land, but he doesn't necessarily manage it. He's got a supervisor in charge of everything, but he does show up from time to time, especially during harvest season, because that's where he's going to make his money through the harvest. So he needs to make sure the harvest is going well, all the workers are happy, and everything's going great. So out of the blue, he shows up that particular day. And he notices that there's somebody in his field that he doesn't recognize. And it happens to be a young woman. So we left off last week with verse 5. It says, Boaz asked the overseer or the supervisor of the harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? And we also pointed out that's a strange question for modern times. We would simply ask, who is that young woman, not who she belongs to. But in the ancient world, chances are she belongs to somebody. She could be a servant of somebody, in which case her master's the one who owns her. She could be a single woman who's never been married, in which case her father, in essence, owns her. Or she could be a married woman, in which case she belongs to her husband. So Boaz wants to know, who does this woman belong to? An interesting question. And then beginning in verse 6, his supervisor is going to answer the question. And he's going to not only answer the question, he's going to give us a whole lot more information as well about her. So verse 6 is where he answers the question. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." So the first thing that he says about this young woman is she's a Moabite. You know, who does she belong to? She belongs to the Moabites, meaning she's not an Israelite, she's not one of us. She's an outsider, she's a foreigner who just so happens to be here. Then the second thing he says about her is that she came back from Moab with Naomi. So who does she belong to? She belongs to Naomi. And it's interesting in this description that the overseer doesn't mention her name, which, of course, that wasn't the question. Boaz didn't ask, who is that woman? He asked, who does she belong to? She belongs to the Moabites. She belongs to Naomi. Maybe he doesn't mention her name because he may have forgotten it. I mean, obviously, he met her earlier that day. And before she went out into the field, this supervisor had a conversation with Ruth. And maybe he forgot her name. Or maybe he felt it wasn't important to give her name. But he certainly knows who she is. In fact, there's been a lot of gossip around town in Bethlehem ever since Naomi came back. You know, Naomi's back. Oh, and she's got this foreign young girl that came back with her. So there's been a lot of gossip in town about who this happens to be. So she's an outsider, and she belongs to Naomi, meaning she's a nobody in Israelite culture. But then the supervisor is going to give more information, not only her identity, but her activity that day. And that comes in verse 7. And the way the NIV translation, the one I happen to be using, translates this, it's very straightforward, makes incredible sense, and it's easy to understand. But the Hebrew behind all of this is a little more complex. So I'm going to go over this somewhat slowly, just to let you know there's a couple of different ways of understanding this. So she said, so this supervisor is going to repeat what Ruth said. And again, he doesn't give her name. She's a she. So she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." Now, there's two ways to understand that sentence. And the first one's really simple. She wants to glean. That was basically a given according to Israelite law. That since she was a foreigner and a widow, she had the right to come and glean, which means she would follow in behind the harvesters, and whatever they left behind, whatever they dropped, was fair game for her. She could pick it up, take it home, and use it. In other words, she got the remainder, the leftover, the scraps. That's what she would actually receive. And that's one good way to understand that. But there's a word in there that seems to not, it shouldn't be there, and that's the word sheaves. And the word sheaves seems to indicate that just maybe Ruth is asking to not only glean, she wants to harvest. In other words, she wants the same rights as all the other workers who are working out in the field, because she uses the word sheaves. Which in that case, Ruth is being a little audacious, a little presumptuous, but she did tell Naomi that she wanted to glean. And one of the reasons some of the scholars jump on this is she asked permission to do whatever she's going to do. Now, if it's a given according to Israelite law that she has the right to glean, why did she stop and ask permission? Which is a good question. It could very well be that she's simply being polite. She's a Moabite, and chances are everybody knows it because it's the little town of Bethlehem, and they've been gossiping about her ever since she showed up. And so since people know she's a Moabite, chances are, as a Moabite, she may not be that familiar with Israelite law. She certainly has never studied it. She only knows what Naomi has told her about Israelite law. And as a foreigner, maybe she's thinking, if I'm polite and respectful, I have a better chance of being accepted than if I'm rude or obnoxious or just take it for granted that I have a right to be there. So chances are, she's not asking to harvest. She's not asking for any special favors. She simply wants to glean because she understands something. She needs food, and so does Naomi. So somebody has to go glean to get the grain, take it home, and cook it so they can eat that night. And so chances are that's all she's asking for. There's another issue in the next sentence where it says, she came into the field and has remained here from morning till now. Now, that Hebrew word that's translated remain can be translated remain or continue, but it can also be translated stand or stand still. So the question is, has she been gleaning all morning long, or has she been standing around all morning long? If she's been standing around, that means the supervisor did not give her permission to glean. And those who feel like she was asking for more than just gleaning rights, they're the ones who say she was standing because the supervisor says, I can't let you do that. I just can't let you come in and harvest and take whatever you want. I'm going to have to ask the boss, the owner, about that one. So if she's standing, she did not get permission to glean or to harvest, and she's been waiting for Boaz to show up so that she can ask. But chances are, that's not what that means. Chances are she's remained there. She's continued there. Because she's not the first person to ever show up in a field owned by Boaz and ask to glean. In fact, she's probably not the only gleaner out in the field that day. So chances are the supervisor said, go ahead. Especially when he finds out that, oh, you belong to Naomi? Yeah, we know Naomi. So go ahead and glean. So chances are she's been working hard all day long. Then there's a final phrase at the end of verse 7, except for a short rest in the shelter. And the NIV has made a really nice sentence out of that, but in the Hebrew it's rather clumsy. The idea seems to be that she's been working hard all morning long, except for the fact she took a break. And apparently out in the field somewhere were these portable shelters or huts, so that if you get tired, you can take a rest. If you need water, you can take a rest. If it's time to eat, you can go in the shelter and eat, and the shelter will give you some shade from the sun. Now, it's late April, early May, so chances are it's going to get hot. And harvesting, gleaning, well, that's not an easy job. So chances are you're going to get hot and sweaty and thirsty and exhausted and hungry very quickly as you're doing this job. So apparently at one point she decides that she's simply going to take a rest. So basically what I think this means is Ruth showed up that morning, and out of respect and out of politeness, she asked the individual, the supervisor, if it's okay if she glean. And she tells the supervisor who she is, or maybe he even knew because rumors have been flying around, and he gives her permission. So she's been working all morning long. And by the way, as a gleaner, you get the leftovers. So if the harvesters do a really good job of getting everything, you don't get much. So it's going to take a long time for you to finally get enough grain that you're going to feel satisfied to go home and cook it up. So she's been there all day, and she did take a break in the shelter for a period of time. Well, regardless of how the supervisor feels about her, becomes of no consequence because the next part of this is Boaz's conversation with Ruth. And this is the first time the two of them are going to have a conversation. And so we have this incredible scene. Well, for the very first time, Boaz and Ruth are out in the field, and there's going to be this dynamic conversation. Actually, there's two conversations. The first one is in verses 8 through 13. Then there's a second conversation in verse 14. Now, in 8 through 13, it's a back and forth dialogue. Boaz will talk, Ruth will respond. Boaz will talk again, and Ruth will respond again. But in the second conversation, only Boaz will speak. Now, since Boaz is the landowner, he takes the initiative in the conversation, and he makes the longer speeches. Ruth's responses are rather short and to the point. So that's what we're going to find in verses 8 through 13. So in verse 8, it says, "So Boaz said to Ruth." So Boaz finds out all this information from the supervisor. So instead of pressing him for more information, he simply leaves the supervisor and goes and finds Ruth. And he's going to have a conversation with her. So at this point, the supervisor's kind of out of the picture, and now there's a conversation between Boaz and Ruth. And there's some interesting ways in which the author presents this. And the first one is, so Boaz said to Ruth. What's missing is Boaz said to Ruth, the Moabite. All of a sudden, the Moabite disappears. Because it appears that the author wants us to know that Ruth is not going to be treated like a Moabite. She's going to be treated as a person. And she's going to be respected by Boaz. In fact, we can learn a lot from this conversation tonight from Boaz about how to treat people. And he treats Ruth with respect. In fact, when he goes and he's going to call her my daughter. Listen to me. My daughter? Well, in the ancient world, you would call someone your daughter if you were an older male speaking to a younger woman. So apparently Boaz is a few years older than Ruth. Enough older that he can call her my daughter. Also, by calling her daughter, it communicates care and concern. It's interesting what he doesn't call her. He doesn't say, hey, Moabite woman over there. Hey, you Moabite. I want to talk to you. He doesn't do that. He says, daughter. Now, Naomi also referred to Ruth as daughter. Not just daughter-in-law, but daughter. It communicates concern. It communicates the fact that he cares about her. So he's not going to treat her as a foreigner, a Moabite. Looks like he's going to treat her as a daughter, which now we're beginning to think maybe there's hope. Maybe there's going to be hope for Ruth. Maybe there's hope for Naomi because of Boaz and what he's willing to do. Then he gives her 3 specific instructions. And the first one is, don't go and glean in another field. Now, back in the ancient world, all the fields kind of ran together. They were separated by rocks. There wasn't a fence, there wasn't a wall, there were some rocks. And that's what separated the field. And of course, Ruth has never been there before. She happened to stumble onto a field owned by Boaz. She didn't go there deliberately. That's just where she happened to show up. And so she could kind of wander off of his property onto somebody else's property, not even knowing that she would do that. It's also interesting with these rocks as boundary markers. There's a law in the book of Deuteronomy and a proverb about not moving them. Because if you were a landowner, if you could move those rocks like an inch or two every day for a period of time, you could steal land from somebody else. And so there were all these laws about not moving the rocks. It's kind of like a football team, and it's 4th and 1. You don't have to go far, but if the center kind of moves the ball forward, that would be an advantage, which, by the way, that's illegal. It's a 5-yard penalty if you get caught. But it's just trying to gain an advantage. And so, again, it's against the law to move those rocks, to take land from someone else. But Boaz says, don't go into another field. I'm going to treat you like a daughter, but I can't guarantee that other landowner over there will treat you the same way. So don't wander into somebody else's property. Then he goes on to say, don't go away from here. In other words, stay on my land. So don't go anywhere else. You need to stay right here on my property. And then he says, stay here with the women who work for me. So that's an interesting thing. He's going to allow Ruth, in essence, to become one of his female servants. So he says to Ruth, I want you to hang out with these women harvesters. Now, there's a great advantage to doing that because the women would come in behind and harvest, and whatever they left, Ruth would be first in line to get what they dropped or what was left behind. So as a gleaner, she's like, in the number one position to get the leftover crop. So that's a great thing for her. Also, it's part of her identity. She's called a Moabite everywhere else. But if she can be identified with the servants of Boaz, that would give her a better social position in Israelite society. If she could become friends with them, that would help her integrate into the Israelite community. And it would also be a way to protect her. So if Ruth was always surrounded by this group of women, that would be a way to protect her, as opposed to having her out there all by herself, where someone could do her harm. So Boaz is trying to protect her. He's also trying to help her fit in to the community. Because again, he's not addressing her as a Moabite. He addresses her as a daughter, somebody I care about. Well, there's other instructions in verse 9. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. So to find Boaz's field, you just have to find his harvesters. And then there's the group of women who come after the harvesters, and you're to join them. So that's how you know you're in the right spot. And I want you, every time you come here, to follow the women harvesters. That's where you would belong. Then he goes on to say, I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And perhaps we should translate that. I am going to tell the men not to lay a hand on you, because he will do so in verses 15 and 16. So he hasn't yet spoken to the men, but he's going to around mealtime. Then he says not to touch her or to lay a hand on her. And the idea is to touch her or lay a hand on her in a way that could do her harm. And since he's talking to the men, he may have in mind sexual harassment. I mean, she's a Moabite. There's no one to protect her. She's on her own. Her parents are miles away. Naomi's old and she can't do anything, so she would be vulnerable to them. But being in this group of women now, that's not probably the biggest issue. The biggest issue is name calling. You know, she gets name called as the Moabite. If there were any Moabite jokes in the day, the men may be telling her some Moabite jokes. Also, they may harass her by saying, you know, where did you get that grain? You're not allowed to have that. You have to give that back. So they could take some of the grain from her. In other words, Boaz is going to tell the men not to act like a jerk when they're around Ruth. He's trying to protect her. And he's going to do anything and everything he can to do that. He understands she's a Moabite, she's a foreigner, she's vulnerable, she's someone who could easily be picked on and someone who could be harmed, and he's trying to make sure that doesn't happen. He goes on to say that he's going to give her permission to get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. Well, before they go out into the fields, they have to go to the well and gather water because it's going to get hot and people are going to get thirsty. And out in the fields, there's no well, so you have to get the water from town and you have to carry it out to the fields. Probably place it in the shelters that have been set up so that if you get tired, you get thirsty, and you're a worker, you're one of Boaz's slaves, you can go into that shelter and help yourself to the water. And not only that, but Ruth can now do that as well. She's not one of his servants, but she has access now to the shelters, and she has access to the water. Now, Boaz breaks a couple of conventions, couple of traditions, and the way he's got things set up. And the first one is it's normally the women who draw the water for the men. In fact, we all know the story in John chapter 4 about the woman at the well. So it was normally a woman's responsibility to draw the water. And the question is, why are the men drawing the water in this story? And chances are, maybe the containers were quite large, and most of the women could not lift them. Also, you had to carry them from the town out to the field, and maybe that became more of a man's job at that point. But Ruth can now drink from this water that the men have drawn. Also, according to tradition, the foreigners were supposed to draw the water for the Israelites. So in other words, if you were the low person on the totem pole, you got to draw the water. But in this case, Ruth is going to be able to drink from these water jars that are in the shelters. So you have a gleaner drinking the water that belongs to the workers. You also have a Moabite, not an Israelite, drinking from those vessels. So, as people look around, is that a Moabite woman drinking from one of our water jars? Yes, it is. And Boaz says it's okay. And if Boaz says it's okay, then it's okay. So, again, he's breaking all of these traditions, being extremely kind to Ruth. And how is Ruth going to respond to all of this? Well, that's verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. So apparently she drops to her knees, and she bows her head either to the ground or even touching the ground. Why would she do that? Well, it was a sign of respect in the ancient world. It was also an expression of emotion. Interesting that Ruth is totally shocked by what Boaz is doing. It's like, okay, I don't even know this guy. And I'm sure this guy doesn't know me. But he's given me all these privileges. He's making sure that I'm being taken care of. I mean, who is this guy? And, this is the owner. Maybe she would, I got to meet the owner. Ooh, fear to meet the owner. But instead, the owner is incredibly gracious to her. So she bows down and she is so thankful for what he has done. And then she says, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Now, it's interesting that Ruth at the beginning of the day says to Naomi, I'm going to go out and glean in a field, in a field from whom I can find favor. So she went looking for favor. Maybe it was a prayer. Text doesn't say. Or maybe it wasn't a prayer, and maybe Ruth wasn't spiritual enough at this point to even know how to pray to the God of Israel. But it was kind of like that was her wish for the day. And in essence, a prayer that God answers, even though she may not have voiced it. You ever had one of those answered? You didn't even bother to ask, and God answered anyways. I mean, that's pretty cool when that happens. Because God knows what you need and knows what you want, and he answers sometimes, and you didn't even bother to ask. She finds favor. She finds incredible favor in Boaz. I mean, he treats her far better than she could ever expect. And that's one of the reasons I think that Ruth in verse 7 did not show up wanting special favors. She's shocked that Boaz is treating her this way. And she goes, "Why have I found such favor in the eyes that you notice me?" Interesting. She's surprised that the landowner even notices her, pays attention to her. One of the greatest needs of people in general is to be noticed, for someone to pay attention to them. Have you ever seen a kid like on the swing set or the monkey bars? He's out there, showing off. And what does he do? He looks at mom and dad and says, "Hey, Mom, hey, Dad, look at me. Notice me. Pay attention to me." It's one of the greatest needs we have as people. The sad reality is that there are many people in our culture doing crazy things so that someone will notice them and pay attention to them. Maybe mom and dad didn't notice them on the monkey bars, didn't show up at their soccer game, didn't show up at the piano recital. And now they're screaming out, "Pay attention to me. Notice me." I mean, that's kind of another sermon in and of itself as to what's happening in our world today as people are screaming out, "Notice me, pay attention to me." And you may have some people living around you. They're not children anymore. They're adults. But they may be screaming out, "Notice me. Pay attention to me. My kids don't call me. I'm just here alone. Notice me. Pay attention to me." A great ministry is just noticing people, paying attention to people, listening to people's stories. Because chances are, if they're yelling, "Look at me, pay attention to me," they've got a story that they want you to hear. I teach new members classes from time to time, and often in those new members classes, people will say, "You're like the third or fourth church that I visited, but those others that I visited, nobody paid attention to me, nobody said hello to me." So they didn't stay. And they show up here, and the fact that they're in the new members class means somebody paid attention to them. Somebody noticed them. So a great ministry for everybody on Sunday morning is simply Pay attention to the people around you. Notice the people around you. If they've shown up for church, they want to be noticed. They want somebody to pay attention to them. They want somebody to talk to them. And that's all you have to do. Easy. Introduce yourself. Say hello. People want to be noticed. And here's Ruth. Now, she's a foreigner. It's a small town. Her greatest fear is that everybody in town's going to reject her, except for Naomi, who let her come. And what's going to happen to Ruth if nobody in town pays attention to her, notices her, or tries to help her? What will her life look like? And she is so overwhelmed that somebody noticed her. And then she says, a foreigner. Ruth knows who she is. She knows she's taking a huge chance. Leaving her country, her people, her friends, her family, coming to a brand new country where she knows nobody except Naomi, hoping she can fit in. And here Boaz lays out this incredible plan where she can hang out with the other women, kind of blend in, not stick out like a sore thumb, where she can glean and glean bountifully, get plenty of food so she can be taken care of. Hopefully those women will become her friends. They'll have conversations. She'll blend in, and she'll be taken care of. And the guys will behave themselves and not say anything to her or try to steal her food or treat her in any way negatively. Boaz has done all that for her. And Ruth does ask a really good question. Why are you doing this? I mean, what's in it for you? Well, the answer is in verse 11. In fact, Boaz is going to answer in two ways. An explanation in verse 11, which we're going to look at. Then there's a blessing in verse 12, which we'll look at next week. But it starts with the explanation. Why are you treating me so well? Why are you showing me such incredible favor? The answer is, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. In fact, I've been told means I've been told and told again. In other words, people are gossiping about you like crazy. And they're telling your story. I know your story, Ruth. I know what you did for Naomi. I know how you sacrificed for her. I understand the chance that you've taken in coming to the land of Israel to help out Naomi, risking everything to do it. And so that's why I'm showing you favor. You showed great favor to Naomi. I'm going to return the favor and show great favor to you. And in the Old Testament, in the ancient world, there was something called the law of reciprocity, which basically says one favor deserves another. We have another saying in our culture. It's what comes around goes around. So if you do something good should happen to you. And if you do something bad should happen to you. It's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's good for good, it's evil for evil. And in many ways, that's the law the ancients lived by. And it was kind of part of their culture. It was even part of Israelite culture. Because they knew the covenant with Moses, where God said, follow me and I'll bless you. Don't follow me and I'll curse you. So, whatever you put out there is coming back at you. That was the law of reciprocity. And that's one of the values that Boaz lives by. So Boaz says to Ruth, you have been so kind to Naomi. I'm going to return the favor. I'm going to be so kind to you. You showed favor, I'm going to show favor to you. So, in essence, what? The seeds that she has sown, so to speak, have produced the crop. She sowed seeds of kindness and love and loyalty. Now she's going to reap those, thanks to Boaz. Then he goes on to say, how you left your father and mother. Now, this is kind of interesting, and I've kind of thought about this some more. There was a moment when Orpah leaves. And Naomi looks at Ruth and says, aren't you going to leave too? Aren't you just going to go back to your family? Start your life over in Moab? And Ruth clings to Naomi and basically says, if I leave you now, it's going to be like I'm abandoning you. And I'm not going to do that. But in not abandoning Naomi, she does abandon her own mother and father. She leaves the country. She begins a brand new life, not involving her parents, but involving her mother-in-law. She chose her mother-in-law over her own mom and dad. And Boaz looks at that and goes, nobody does that. I mean, who does that? I mean, what incredible loyalty, what a risk, what favor you have shown Naomi, that you would do that. And then it goes even beyond that. You left your homeland. When you live in Moab and you're a Moabite, you know how Moabite society works. And you're comfortable with it because you grew up in it. Now you're in the land of Israel. And you don't know how anything works. In Moab, there's going to be at least some people who are going to like you and love you and want to take care of you. But in Israel, it could be that nobody's going to like you, love you, or want to take care of you. What a risk to leave your homeland. And have come to live with a people you did not know before. She's come to live with the Israelites. Now, she knew about them because she married one. And I'm sure her husband told her about life in Israel and about, how the culture of Israel, the religion of Israel, and how life really works in Israel. I'm sure she's heard it. And I'm sure Naomi has explained Israel to Ruth. But it's one thing to hear about it. It's another thing to live among the people. I mean, you can hear about the people. Oh, the Israelites, they're such good people. But then you go to live there. Are they going to be such good people? So in other words, knowing about a people and living with a people are not the same thing. But she was willing to leave it all behind with no promise of anything. I mean, Naomi couldn't promise her anything. Naomi's not rich. She didn't say, hey, come back to the land of Israel and I'm rich, so you'll be taken care of for life. Nope. In fact, they get back to Israel and Naomi doesn't do anything. Ruth has to initiate. Do you think I should go out and glean and get us some food so we can eat? Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Somebody's got to take care of us. And here she is. She spent all morning long working hard for Naomi. Because Naomi's back at the house, depressed and not doing so well. And Boaz says, look at all you've done. I'm going to pay you back. You've shown favor. I'm going to show favor. And what a great lesson from Boaz about how to treat people. I mean, everybody else was treating Ruth as a Moabite. He didn't even refer to her as a Moabite. Called her his daughter. Treated her like family. Treated her like a person. Treated her with great respect. That's how we should treat people. Don't put labels on them. Just treat them as a person and love them and respect them and do the right thing for them. Well, we'll pick up the story again next week. But a great lesson on how to treat people. And remember, people are calling out. Notice me. Pay attention to me. In your neighborhood, with the people you know, with the new people who show up on Sunday morning or Wednesday. Notice me. Pay attention to me. So notice them and pay attention to them and listen to their story. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. There's so much about life and about people that we can learn. There's so much about human nature that we can learn. There's so much about just being a person who cares about others that we can learn. And Father, we pray that we will be like Boaz and treat people well. Treat them with respect. Don't treat them with a label. Treat them as a person. And so, Father, I pray for all of us that you would give us an opportunity to speak to someone who's looking for answers, to speak to somebody who's looking for a friend, to speak to someone who's crying out, look at me, notice me, pay attention to me. And may we be the people who pay attention, who notice, who pray, who befriend, who treat people with respect. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.